welcome to the CityLab session on cities in the age of protest. My name is Marianna Evenstein. I'm an anchor at Germany's international broadcaster, DW, and I am very honored to be moderating this conversation with two of the world's most dedicated and engaged mayors. Muriel Bowser is the mayor of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, and and Claudia López Hernández is the mayor of Bogotá, Colombia. Welcome to both of you. So I think everybody here has noticed that the scale, the intensity of global protests is on the rise. Just looking at a few examples, just from the past couple of years, we had global climate change protests, we've had crowds demonstrating against COVID lockdowns, against vaccine mandates, against mask mandates. We had also people very upset and angry about the economic impact of these COVID lockdowns. We had a global wave of Black Lives Matter activism. We've also seen mass marches around the world against economic and social inequality, against corruption. And of course, right now, in the last couple of weeks, and today as we speak, we are seeing enormous protests across cities in Iran, triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody, but really it has morphed into a broader movement of frustration and demand for women's rights and, more broadly, human rights in Iran. So people are angry, they're frustrated, and they're taking their anger and frustration onto the streets, and it's up to city leaders to manage these kinds of protests. And Mayor Lopez, we know, of course, that your country, Colombia, and in particular your city, Bogotá, has seen wave after wave of protests over the last couple of years about a whole range of issues. And unfortunately, many of these demonstrations turned very violent. There were deaths. There were also reports of the police using excessive force, including even using live ammunition on demonstrators. How do you, as a mayor, respond to evidence of police brutality, but also other violence by participators of these protests in your city?
Well, first of all, let me say that coming from a country that had a previous civil war for 60 years, I'm absolutely empathetic with Ukrainians. And I think we need to support them as much as they just ask. Now, in my own country, let me put this in context, how I react to evidence. I collected the evidence. I presented the evidence to the Attorney General's office. I presented the evidence to the Human Rights Commission of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. I asked the national government, the President of Colombia is the chief top commander of the police. I demanded justice and I demanded change. That's what I did on behalf of my citizens, particularly the youngsters in my city who were rightly protesting and who were abused. Unfortunately, it took time. It took time for us to listen. It took time for us to change, to offer solutions. It's not by policing that we're going to manage social unrest. Social unrest has social causes, and we need to address the deep causes. So my answer as mayor was to put in place and to propose to the city council a social recovery plan to offer more employment for kids, for youngs, and for women who were particularly affected by the pandemic. Second of all, to set up the largest infrastructure plan in the city's history to provide jobs for families, for income families. Third of all, to provide, by first time in Colombia's history, in Bogotá's history, a basic income guarantee to prevent hunger, basically. No democracy, but it takes time. So in the meantime, you're doing this, you're offering this, basic income, this job recovery program, but it takes time. It took a year, and in the meantime, people is suffering from hunger and suffering from poverty. And no democracy is feasible under 30% employment and 40% poverty. No democracy can survive to that. So reacting quickly, listening to people, managing as much as you can, keeping alive the small businesses who provide 60% of the jobs in my city. And at the same time, respecting the police, but demanding change on the police officers who abuse their position. So those 5 things were, the things that I could manage to do. Fortunately enough, after a year, things are better. Unemployment came from 30% to 11%. Poverty has dropped out, 40% now is 28% roughly. So things are going better. But, and finally, the protesters were able to change the national scenario, to change the national government peacefully, in a democratic, peaceful election that brought the first leftist change government in Colombia's history. So it was hard, but it paid off.
Mayor Bowser, we've seen in the United States as well intense national debate about how to fix the problem of police brutality while not undermining the role that police play in keeping the public safe. And all of this, juggling, of course, that we need to ensure that civil rights are respected, and we also want to make sure that people can exercise their right to demonstrate. And I know that you yourself found yourself caught in the middle of this debate, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, following the police killing of George Floyd. Unfortunately, those protests as well very quickly deteriorated into mayhem. There was looting, there was arson, a lot of property damage. And you eventually were forced to impose curfews, and there were lots of arrests made. So how do you strike this very difficult balance between supporting civil rights and also supporting the police department, which you oversee?
No, for sure. And what is important is that we are a city that protest is in our DNA. We're the nation's capital. Americans from all over our country come to Washington, D.C. to protest. So we embrace a protest culture. It is our First Amendment right to assemble and address our grievances to our federal government. So every day, not just in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, but every day, just about, there's some kind of protest activity in Washington, D.C. Women are coming to Washington, D.C. almost every day to protest the attack on our bodily autonomy that we're undertaking right now. So that is part of our culture. Now, as mayors, we also have to protect the services that we're responsible for, public safety and order that we're responsible for. But as human beings, we also have to feel the hurt and the grief that people around our country felt watching this attack on our fellow American, where he died. And so what we saw in our city over several days of protests, mostly peaceful. And I'm sure the mayor and others will agree that oftentimes when you have thousands of people coming together hurt and angry and needing a response from their government, there will be some among them who aren't peaceful, but most of them are peaceful. So we take seriously our job, our police department, working with our federal partners in Washington, D.C., to make sure that we can have peaceful protest. But we also have to maintain order. And that is a delicate balance, but it's one that we can reach. And we had the experience of also being a city government that was at odds with the federal government, who I frankly thought was antagonizing the situation, pitting police against Americans. And we had to take a stand to say, not only are we going to protect our city boundaries, our DC values and American values, but somebody has to stand up and speak out against this bully. And we were able to use our city streets, not only to send a message that we have the right to assemble, we're peacefully assembling, but that we can't have the federal government attacking Americans in the street. So it is a delicate balance, but it is one that is achievable, I think, with a lot of planning to give people the freedom to protest, but not allowing small groups within them to disrupt.
You mentioned planning, and this reminds me of what you said in the wake of the January 6th riots at the Capitol, where police were completely overwhelmed. You said that was a clear indicator of failure with security at the Capitol. So when we anticipate that this is going to happen again, it's going to happen in the future, how can a city best prepare for protests that we unfortunately have to assume at least part of those protesters will be violent? How does a city prepare?
Well, I think in the terms of January 6th, and you have to understand our city, that the Capitol building, of course, is a federal enclave that the federal government polices. And the city government will come in to support it. But the federal government, I think, has to take the stance. And we, frankly, I think nobody really believed in the federal space that people would try to overturn an election at the Capitol building while it was still taking place. That's the truth. And I think that the whole intelligence infrastructure of the country has to take seriously this nationalist, white nationalist movement in our country and be able to defend it. So that's what we saw. And unfortunately, to the mayor's point, we have to step back because it's more than just the planning of showing up in the city. It's what's happening to our institutions back at home related to voting. We heard the mayor earlier talking about the erosion of trust in our institutions and government and elections. And unfortunately, we see that happening. Now, on the back end for mayors, we're quite frankly thinking about our midterm elections coming up, making sure that we're preparing for people from around the country descending on Washington and making sure that we're safe.
And Mayor Lopez, how would you prepare then for future protests in Bogotá, looking at what has happened in the past to try and prevent the kind of violence and injuries that we've seen? What can you do?
Well, as much as Washington is the capital of the entire country, also is Bogotá. So we are always, used to having people making their loud voice heard at the national government in the capital city. So that's normal for Bogotá. That's normal for Bogotá. So instead of, we don't have a local police. I definitely think we should have. That's one of the reforms that I expect to learn. But most importantly, what Bogotá did was to ensemble a team of professional social dialogue, of community managers, more than 500 people who will go to every single protest, even before they happen, will talk to the organizers, will hear their demands, will make them heard to the national institution that they want to be listened to, or to the local institution that they want to be listened to. Will make sure that before, during, and after the protest, there will be some sort of serious dialogue about the deep issues that they want to address. They will be on the streets, working side by side with human rights defenders, taking seriously whatever they notice, whatever they say, whatever denunciations they made. That's what the Bogotás have been done. So we went from having sort of 150 community organizers and social dialogue professionals. We now have almost 800 to attend this previously, during, and after, following up what happens. Because many people came to Bogotá and said, look, I've did this 5 years ago, and then 10 years ago, and nobody really have solved the problem, and I'm not taking seriously. And that's the deep cause, at least in Colombia, is that people has spoke and spoke and spoke and tell what they need, and come to a meeting and come to another meeting and come to and nobody actually solved the issue. They are not taken seriously and respected. And that's at the end, that lack of respect, right? That lack of listening is at the end the problem. Because I can tell you, when I come to the streets for people who's protesting against the mayor's office, because of poverty, because of hunger, because of unemployment, because of the public works, congest traffic, and so on and so forth, when you come forward and you say, respectfully and seriously, look, this is what I can do, this I cannot do. Don't expect me to do this. I will explain you why I cannot do that, why I can only do this. Well, you have a better idea. Let's try to. When you seriously and respectfully say yes and say no, people can understand reasons. In general, people can understand reasons and make agreements. What they cannot tolerate, and they should not, is an unrespectful playing with their own needs and their own expectations. And I also think because national politics, more and more globally, is in this politics of division, then I will take Mayor Bloomberg's advice 2 years ago. You are the politics of hope. You in the city, with your citizens, you gotta be the manager of hope. You have no other choice to do it. Hope and deliver and collective action. That's what we should master as mayors, I think, beyond public utilities and social services. That, of course, is our mandate. But in our current time is collective action to take care of the people, because only people who are respected and taken care of can take care of our democracies. And only democracies commit to peace or to climate change or to human rights. So that's the order, I think. That's the actual order and social order that people is demanding. People is not going to agree on unsocial order and social injustice order. They're not going to agree on that. So we better listen to that.
But you really touch upon the big challenge as a city leader. There are certain things that you can influence, and then there are other bigger issues that you have limited influence on. And Mayor Bowser, I know that you very recently have been the target of protests about how your city is handling this influx of migrants being bussed in from states like Florida and Texas. And I mean, that itself is an act of protest by those governors about the federal government's immigration policies, but you know, you cannot be personally responsible for the federal government's immigration policies and all of the consequences that
you think not.
Right. So
she said
yeah. Right. So, well, yeah. I mean, this is exactly the challenge. So, how do you respond to the protesters in this kind of situation? How do you explain to your residents that there are limitations about what a local leader can actually change?
Yeah, well, how I say it is mayors are responsible for a lot of things. We're not responsible for federal immigration policy until it lands on our border. And so Washington, D.C. has become like a southern border state. Excuse me. And we actually have a very practical response, an emergency response. I've explained it, I think, very clearly to DC residents, how I'm going to handle it, and they're standing with me. I think what's been important is that we're acting in accordance with our values, and we're acting with urgency. But I think the mayor is right, and you're right. There are a lot of things that we can't influence, but we can use our seats to talk about our values and promote what they are. I'll give you something that's a little bit more fun or pleasant, I should say, in talking about this, some protests that we do from our own office. And we have flags, like we have all of the world's flags in a big warehouse. And on Pennsylvania Avenue, sometimes we send a message with those flags. And after the invasion of Ukraine, we put up the beautiful Ukrainian flags along Pennsylvania Avenue. We also have, of course, the 50 American states. We're not one of them. We're the nation's capital. We're not a state. We don't have 2 senators. We're not represented in our own capital. So we created a flag with 51 stars and one for Washington, D.C., and we put that up on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think finally, you mentioned what some mayors have gone through, and I know many of my colleagues, we, through this COVID and protest and fighting our federal government, we're on these text chains just sharing our experience, and many of us have been personally targeted for protest. Many of us at our homes and having to have extra security and having all these social media attacks. That's also a part of being in public office and the demonstration of, people can address their grievances, but it puts us in kind of the middle of how to not only protect our downtowns and our commercial areas, but how to protect our own families. So it has been an interesting few years indeed.
And we can be sure that the next years will remain very interesting.
Yes.
So Mayor Bowser, Mayor Lopez, thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.